All right, guys, this is Jasvinder Khalsa with cryptocurrencyinvesting.news and coinfeeds.com, and we're back with Arjun Bhuptani from Connext. Arjun, thanks for taking some time to talk to us. So I guess we'll just start from square one. Tell us about your company, and we'll go from there.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess to understand what we do, you kind of have to understand the big problem with tokens right now, which is that it's really, really difficult to buy them. Most of the companies that are issuing tokens as a means to get access to the product that they're building are issuing them with the assumption that they will eventually have mainstream users who will be able to buy and use that token. That's practically impossible for most users right now, even for people within the industry, because you have to first go buy Ether or Bitcoin, find some sort of on-chain exchange to get the token liquidity, something like Shapeshift, use a wallet, use my Ether wallet, and then MetaMask. It's kind of a nightmare. What we did is we worked with a bunch of compliance people, regulators and lawyers and ecosystem stakeholders to rebuild that process from the ground up. By integrating Connext, companies reduce that process for their users down to just plugging in your card details and hitting checkout. That's pretty much it.
Great.
And then using your tokens is just a matter of using the normal in-app flow, and the wallet is transacted with automatically.
So let's talk about, that's fantastic. Let's talk about the kinds of problems for users and how severe they can be, and just kind of really sort of establishing context that like the need for the solutions in that place, and maybe even just the personal experiences that have inspired you to innovate in this way specifically.
Sure, absolutely. Let me start with a personal experience. So I've been working in this industry since I guess late last year. I kind of worked on a bunch of different projects, tried building out my own DApp. I had a really, really hard time getting adoption because what I built at the time was a grant-making platform for nonprofit entities, basically a new way for them to get funding. And when I went to nonprofit organizations and said, hey, this is a new source of funding for you guys, you can crowdfund your grants as opposed to getting them directly from a grant-making organization, they said, no, I don't think we want to use this because it's too hard. I think anytime that you offer somebody free money and they say they don't want to use it because it's too difficult to use the platform, there is a problem there, a very, very big problem.
I would agree, yes, certainly.
So I kind of started trying to think about, well, how do payments work? How do we actually make this easy for people to use? How do we let people purchase tokens or pay for these grants very easily, and how do we let them interact with these contracts easily? And what I found was that was a big enough, hairy enough, difficult enough idea that it was extensible to becoming its own entity. And from talking to a bunch of other companies in the industry, we've found that really is such a huge issue.
Absolutely. So in terms of the reception for what you guys have been doing so far, how's that been going?
Awesome. We're working with a bunch of different companies in the industry already. We've officially announced partnerships with Hello Sugoi, Ethereum, Decentraland, a few other entities that are kind of closer to revenue, already have users, and are working with a bunch of and are working with tokens, hoping to get that out to people soon. We've also gotten a lot of interest from a lot of the bigger entities in the space. It's just kind of a matter of who gets to revenue first. And so we prioritize companies that are closer. Hopefully we'll be generating revenue like January, February next year. Sure.
So in terms of I know that anytime it's like almost anytime you level up or upgrade anything, right? What ends up happening is you solve a problem and then you get to sort of a new level where there are problems that sort of only exist at that new level, right? Like basically new problems. I guess I'm wondering, have you encountered things like that so far? What kinds of challenges have emerged, since these breakthroughs have been made?
Yeah. So it's been kind of a continuous process of we build something and then we face some challenges and we find some way around those challenges and we come up with a new innovative solution. What we've ended up right now is kind of a cohesive UX solution for both purchasing, like managing, and then dealing with compliance. And the reason that we've done it that way is because initially we started with, okay, let's just let people pay with credit cards. And that seems like a very simple concept in and of itself, but then there's a lot that goes into that. After you pay for a token with credit cards, where did the tokens go? If you're going into your own wallet, then how do you make sure that the person is compliant? How do you make sure that the person is going to use the token? If you buy Filecoin, for instance, how do you make sure that the person is going to use Filecoin in the Filecoin network and not use it to pay for their groceries? And that seems innocuous, but that all of that adds layers of complexity to regulators, to credit card people, to banks that we're working with.
Absolutely.
That dramatically change how they feel about this industry. So one of the, so like an example of an issue that we ran into was, we're doing all of this compliance stuff. We need people to use a managed wallet solution that builds in these compliance checks internally, so in that way you don't have to worry about doing that as a company or as a user. But how do we make sure that that's still trustless? And what we've been working on so far is finding a way to sign transactions from a third party smart contract that is a managed wallet. So transactions that are being initiated by another entity, finding a way for the user to sign that transaction without their own wallet. Really, really interesting problem that relies on a zero-knowledge proof, and we really think that we have a working solution to that.
So it's fascinating in terms of, so like when you see these data breaches or these wallet hacks. I mean, I'm blanking on the name of it. There was a
Parity.
big, and I think was it Tether, or something that had what was the company where the guy said that he just accidentally froze like 130 million in
I think
assets?
that was Parity.
Exactly. The Parity hack. I mean, when you see that, what comes to mind? Aside from thank God my money isn't in Parity.
I'm kind of glad that I didn't have any money in Parity, but I think it's one of those things where the right kind of tools to check and verify don't exist yet. There are generally accepted design principles for smart contracts, and then there are also just general principles for programming that should be followed, best practice principles.
Right.
It was exactly the very, very base level principles which were violated in the Parity hack. It wasn't anything that was particularly sophisticated.
Right.
And in other hacks that have happened in the past.
Right.
But what it comes down to is that people make mistakes when they're issuing contracts and things like that, especially if you're a company that's pushing a lot of updates, and that's what happened with Parity. What we need isn't, what we need is obviously more stringent audits and more stringent checks, and people to be better at figuring out best design practices,
right.
And more templates to pull from, like ERC20 and other things like that. But the other thing that we need is an actually good way to deal with these problems. Formal verification is the only thing that seems to make sense in that regard.
Right. Who have you talked to in this space that's innovating in terms of that kind of identity verification, authentication, and sort of cybersecurity? If anyone, who's really kind of sort of gotten on your radar in that way, or?
So do you mean identity verification or code verification?
I would say either one. In terms of closing these kinds of loopholes in general. I know there's a number of guys out here on these booths who are having a similar conversation. It's obviously everyone's doing something in a different way, or they're tackling it from a different angle. Yeah. But there's obviously a lot of attention on this, and I think a lot of the attention on it has to do with these concerns of people who are used to a certain level of oversight and insurance, actually, with fiat currency based systems. For example, ICOs aren't insured, and other things like that. Yeah. So in terms of other, I guess anybody who's on your radar in that way. Yeah.
So on the technological side, there are some entities that are working on these problems. There's entities that are providing contract audits, which are already probably well known to people, but I know that the Blockchain at Berkeley guys have a really, really cool project that they're doing, and it's pretty successful. And I've worked with them quite a bit, and they really know what they're doing. I know Open Zeppelin is just an excellent force in the space. They're working on their own SDK and browser that allows you to build apps and debug them directly in the SDK. So then that way you're protected from the generic or from base level errors in your smart contract creation. I know that the Ethereum protocol itself this is something that's discussed a lot internally. Where they're how can we fix these sorts of issues? I think there was an EIP about it a little while ago. On the other side, on the kind of KYC transaction validation, counterparty risk sort of side, it's easy to say that blockchain transactions are trustless, and so there's no counterparty risk. There is you might not be able to fake a transaction, but you can fake an identity. And that's the primary issue that most of these entities in the space see is how do you deal with that? How do you, and in the case that something like that happens, how do you reverse a transaction? That's something that we're working on. That's a core part of how our vaults work, and we're able to reverse transactions because we're able to kind of control the flow of funds. Other people that are working on identity specifically, Civic is obviously very well known. I think that I don't know what their timeline is for their platform. Really, identity is just a matter of understanding local data protection laws and figuring out what you can and can't put on blockchains. and
Right.
figuring out, like, finding some KYC provider. And KYC providers are everywhere. So,
Showcard is a company that's really hyper focused on that. They're doing some interesting things in that space. They've got its idea of, you know, extricating the identity from a device itself, because if you have access to a device, then you have access to the identity, and and that being a sort of a single point of failure, that they're taking a hard look at that. It's interesting.
One thing I'll say is ZK snarks are like a hype word in the industry now, because people are just, you know, everyone just kind of, the Ethereum industry has this tendency to find some idea and then latch onto it without really where most people fully don't understand what it means and what implications it has. What zero knowledge proofs built in at the chain layer will mean is that you'll be able to do identity proofs and stuff like that without having to actually disclose identity information. And that's really what's missing right now, is you can build all of these solutions, but you're running the risk of you're either giving identity information to a ton of different entities, which as an individual you don't want to happen, or you're putting it on chain, which means that it's vulnerable. Even if it's encrypted, it's vulnerable to being hacked. So the moment that you kind of fix that problem, all of the rest of these solutions will fall into place.
So with that in mind, I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts about the SegWit 2x cancellation, and then this talk of reviving it, because it's that whole theme of separating essentially like the verification process from the actual transaction, increasing the block size, and then the kind of consensus that's necessary to move something like that forward. And if excuse me, if that kind of unanimous consensus is an obstacle, or if it's a good thing, and just sort of that whole kind of aggregate cluster of issues there.
So I haven't actually kept up too much with it. I tend to focus more on like the token industry and things like that rather than protocol level development, just because even though this is such a new industry, even though this is all essentially the same thing, that's already beginning to diverge. You know, if you are either working with dApps and tokens, or you're working with protocol, and sometimes it's very difficult to like kind of like, it's difficult to be involved in both and have your feet in both industries at the same time.
I think so.
That being said, from my understanding, it seems like that is a scalability issue, right? It's a can we make this platform more scalable, or should we kind of preserve the original integrity of the Bitcoin decentralized nature and Satoshi's original like vision? I think this comes down to what your philosophy is on programming and things like that. Personally, I think updatability is something that's really important. Circumstances change. You don't know the initial conditions for what push Bitcoin to be built this way. I think increasing the block size and changing how transaction verification done is probably a good thing, just because of transaction speed and then the environmental damage that having a very that the current kind of paradigm creates. Like I said, though, it's not something that I'm too informed about. So
Sure, fair enough. Yeah,
could see arguments either way.
Absolutely, yeah, and I've heard many of them. You know, I think it's interesting to kind of just get a sense of even someone who's not focusing in that area, just kind of. It's worth talking about when there's a general sense of what's going on, because that does tell you a lot about what information is filtering through to people who aren't really, in buried in the weeds with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is revealing of the climate, or let's say the kind of insularity of different aspects of it. Because you get guys who they just sort of they've heard of Bitcoin, and that's about it. And they don't realize that there are all these. And
that's the vast majority of people who know about this industry, right?
Exactly. Well, Arjun, thanks so much for your time. It's been great talking to you. Really a pleasure.
Talking to you as well.
Awesome. Thanks.